So at this point, I want to turn it over to Shazia Iftikhar, who is an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department, whose work is on race, gender, nationality, particular focus on France and the headscarf issue. And I'm just now meeting you for the first time. She's been here a couple of years, and I've been gone, I think, almost the whole time she's been here, so I'm delighted to meet you. And she will introduce the first panel. So welcome, everybody. Enjoy the day. And please get active in interacting with our speakers.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce James Derian, who is a professor at Brown University, speaking today. He is a research professor with a focus on global security and media studies. He leads the research initiative Global Engagement Through Innovative Media that is funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He is author most recently of Virtuous War, Mapping the Military-Industrial Media Entertainment Network, Critical Practices in International Theory, and co-editors with Kostas Konstantinou of Sustainable Diplomacies. He has produced 3 film documentaries with Idris Film, Virtual Y2K, After 9/11, and most recently Human Terrain, which won the Audience Award at the 2009 festival dei Popoli in Florence, and has been in a selection at numerous film festivals. I also introduce, well, you've met me already. I work on race, gender, and citizenship in France, and looking specifically at the burqa and the Muslim headscarf debates. And I also want to introduce Wan Cole, the other distinguished respondent here, who is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History and Director for the Center of South Asian Studies. For 3 decades, Wan Cole has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His most recent book is Engaging the Muslim World, and he also recently authored Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East. He has been a regular guest on PBS Lara's NewsHour and has also appeared on ABC Nightly News, Nightline, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper, 360, and many others, and has written widely about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and South Asia. He also commented extensively on Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, the Iraq War, the politics of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Iranian domestic struggles and foreign affairs. In addition to his regular column at Truthdig, he continues to write about contemporary Islamic movements, mainstream or radical, and blogs about a number of these political and social issues on his blog, Informed Consent. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Professor James Derian with pleasure.
So we just need to switch from the computers. Well, thank you all for coming out, and particularly to people who organize this. It's been one of the best organized conferences I've ever been to. A year lead time, which is remarkable. But it means that my paper went through several changes in that year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I intended to do and then what I ended up doing. But I feel obligated, largely because I'm the first up, to sort of do a little framing exercise. And Ken has alluded to this, but we are in a world in which the only constant seems to be change, and a great deal of uncertainty, a great deal of precariousness. And what is the relationship between media and power? I think that's very important for this event. And so I just have a couple of words to say about that. When you have power becoming diffused, we hear constantly of how terrorists, private armies, pirates, cartels, the Pope, Brad and Angelina, all of the sort of, the factionalization, diffusiveness of power, and with it, I think, emerges a new player, a new actor that I call global media. And what this represents is a challenge to the state's monopoly of legitimate violence, but also its ability to get one message out. We're probably going to hear it today many times over, and we'll be testing it as we've been instructed, the extent to which something like WikiLeaks can alter the nature of diplomacy, how automated trading has altered political economy, and what this means for stability. This is a big factor, and we're all sort of grasping, I think, for what is the new... Whoops. Sorry. This is what I was going to talk about. It was the heterological nature of international politics. Many voices, and with many voices, you have what I call hetero polarity. It's my attempt to get into the Oxford English Dictionary. Whoops, you see all my notes. Let's go here. I could just like step back and let you watch, read the notes. Is that any better? Yeah, it's a little better. And the heteropolarity is my attempt, I think, to come up with a new configuration of power. You all heard about multipolarity after the Congress of Vienna, the unipolar moment that supposedly lasted, a blink of an eye when the United States emerged victorious from the end of the Cold War. Some people are talking about apolarity, no center of power, just chaos, anarchy. And others are seeing a return to a multipolarity, or even being wishfully nostalgic for a bipolarity in the way that Ken Waltz and others from the realist school have posited this idea of a balance of power. Well, the notion of heteropolarity is that there's many nodes of power, that there are many voices, and they're all competing. And it's very difficult to see how this is going to shake out. And today, I want to look at one particular node, and that is the global media. And originally, when I got the invitation from Will, I was going to talk about documentary filmmaking, which has taken up a lot of my time. The last 5 years, I've been working on one documentary, Human Terrain, which is about this effort to enlist American academics. Juan's very familiar with this effort, and anthropologists in particular, to help in the war effort. When the war started to go south in Fallujah and Al Anbar province in Iraq, suddenly getting to know your enemy became a paramount concern. Who's an enemy, who's not, who's a friend, who's a foe. And this quote you see from David Carr, I think one of the better writers on media. And he wrote this, I think, 7 years ago. I forgot to check the date, but I think it was quite a while ago. And it's certainly, I think, come even truer today when the documentary form, as a feature form, has sort of shrunk. And now anybody with a cell phone and a camera has turned into an amateur filmmaker. So I think this is important. And so I'm going to lead off by showing you just what I think was my effort in this regard to deal with the documentary film, and it's what I was going to talk about, so I think I'm responsible for showing a quick clip of this. This is the a teaser from our film Human Terrain, which, I don't know, has it been shown at the campus? Probably hasn't, has it? Okay, well, we'd love to come again and show it, as long as we don't lock up here. Well, we're going to pass that because we're not getting our response. Let's see why we're not getting a response. Here we go. Might need to pump the sound up a little bit.
We are in a war that is as much a cultural struggle as it is a military struggle that demands subtlety.
Can you take guys like the Marines and say, we want you to be kinder and gentler and culturally aware? What do you do with a rifle? You shoot somebody else.
We wanted to show that we were good people. We were here to help.
Wars are not fought on battlefields anymore. The United States is grappling with it in Iraq and Afghanistan as it did in Vietnam.
They're embracing a type of thinking about war, counterinsurgency warfare, that the Army didn't want to get into at all.
There's a new solution that out there that we have to actively seek.
All our cultural and intellectual sinew will be required in this battle.
Culture is not like Nescafe. It's not something you can just add water and stir.
The version of culture that they have in mind is such that they will find its fool's gold.
I want to know why they hate us.
Well, the Pentagon has a new strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan. An experimental $40 million program called the Human Terrain System has begun enlisting recruits of a different kind to win the battle of hearts and minds. They have graduate degrees in anthropology and serve as cultural advisors to the U.S. military.
He felt that, why am I different than any other young American that is serving?
He sort of spoke of it as a desk job. This is an activity that takes a tremendous amount of empathy.
I have this knowledge, that they don't have. I can help.
Michael said he never served in the military. And I looked at him and told him, I said, what do you think you're doing now?
That is a very seductive idea, that you would be able to help in a situation of crisis. Help what? Help whom to do what?
He was always doing something greater than himself. Why this as opposed to the other things? That's the difficult question we're having to answer.
Strasses, to be advised, we have one urgent surgical, one urgent, 3 KIA.
Roger, good copy. 6 out. Now, that was our effort to not just sort of understand media global media in international affairs, but how do you make global media for international affairs? How do you become one of these players, one of these actors, a global media player? And obviously, I think the relationship between consumer and producer of global media now has become interpenetrated because of the shrinkage, the inexpensiveness of the platforms, but it's also because of training, I think, and because of the expertise of the generation coming up. I think in my case, and probably in some of yours, we often learn from our students about new media more than we'd learn anywhere else from outside the classroom. And this phenomenon means I think we have to develop this kind of fluency, and I would hope in this type of setting that when we talk about new media, we always understand this is a metonym. When I talk about global media, we're really talking about multiple media, and some precision is necessary. And what I want to do is to show how the documentary form can be hijacked. There's always the positive sort of connotation of new media that's presented by many of the sort of techno-utopian fringe, or not fringe, or actually sort of majority these days. And I'm more of a techno-realist and not a techno-determinist, in that I think there is an interaction going on with history, with agency, and with these new tools. And I'm going to tell you a short story about what happened shortly after I got the invitation from Will, and how I got turned away, detoured from the intention, and I ended up doing something very different. And I ended up going back to the future because I was in Berlin at the time, and it ended up, after an op-ed piece I wrote for the Berliner Zeitung, I was literally hijacked. I ended up in the back of a white van with a Deutsche Welle film crew, going all through Berlin. I'm going to show you one little rough cut, just sort of a foreshadow of the final short documentary that Deutsche Welle did about how the sort of this porousness that now exists between political power and global media power acted out at the local level, the municipal level, the city level, the state level, and at the global level, and how the traditional levels of analysis that in some ways University of Michigan helped make famous through J. David Singer's work, he thought these were pretty discrete levels, and you had to be very clear at who you're looking at. Are you looking at state actors? Are you looking at inside the black box of the state? Or are you looking at the billiard balls that are clashing outside the state? These models are very important for how you conceptualize. But my point today, by this little anecdote, is to show you how those levels are becoming much more like the levels of an electron. And I'm bringing in quantum language, but also not just simply as a metaphor, but because I think it really does work in this way. Not simply in that sort of old saw of the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, that when you observe something, you affect its behavior. We're going to see how that happens. But more precisely in quantum physics, on how it's very hard to tell at any given time which reality is the real one, the image or the object of the image. And so I'm just going to give you a brief glimpse of this. This is just a rough cut that Deutsche Welle gave me of some footage. Let me see, I might have to. Gesture a little bit? You'll be able to get the gestures in?
No, I would see them, but
yeah, okay, lovely. But I'd like to gesture a little.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
If you come half a step in front here.
Okay.
Okay, roll it.
James, why is it, do you have any explanation for it, that there are so many streets, places named after a socialist, communist in the eastern part of Berlin?
Well, every regime wants to stamp its identity on the urban landscape, particularly one that styles itself as revolutionary. You have to change street names just as you change rule. So the socialists, the German Democratic Republic, saw fit, of course, to name particular streets, plots after the great iconic figures like Karl here and Friedrich. I mean, this is a critical spot in Berlin. We have the Karl Liebknecht, plots over here. We have the Rosa Luxemburg Memorial over there, the great martyrs of the Communist Party for Germany. And behind us we have the sort of ideological founders. So in some ways, this is the center of the, Marxist, but also Stalinist cosmos. And, to mark that cosmos, you use language, you use names.
Also am Anfang bist du ein bisschen reingekommen, ne?
Ah, okay.
Ja,
I moved into the picture, sorry.
Okay.
Could you make it a little bit more brief?
Okay. And that's what I did. And you're going to see how roughly 4 hours turned into about 2 minutes at the end of this talk. But what really compelled me to sort of adapt this form was something that came up from Secretary of State Schultz. He gave a speech, I think it was back in 1997 at a virtual diplomacy conference. And he referred to quantum diplomacy. And it was a term that he coined along with Sidney Drell, who was an arms control expert and a fairly well-known quantum physicist from Stanford. And this is the quote. And I never saw the term come up again. I've done Google searches. So I'm trying to revive this one, and of course, in some way or another, legitimate my own use of it by citing a former Secretary of State. But also, I'm going to give you a very, very shorthand version of this. The version that the two respondents have relies heavily on Walter Benjamin as my other guide. Now, Walter Benjamin, who obviously was a... First, I'm going to show you one other quote here. That's an important quote. Let's see here. There it is. He's referring here to the flaneur that was drawn from the work of Baudelaire, the notion of the dandy going through the streets, of the alienated gaze. And I feel that, as intellectuals, as academics, taking the alienated gaze towards media is very important, but here he's talking about how this alienated gaze, walking through the streets, one street in particular, of course, Paris, but he was also thinking, I think, of Germany when he's writing about this in the 30s, of how you become entangled through this interaction with the city. And largely it's because I think the ubiquity, interconnectivity, reflexivity of media, multiple points of observation take place, and you have these phase shifts of reality. And Benjamin was fantastic about this, and I urge you, if you want to, I'll share the paper, where it's in the Arcades project, he's trying to replicate this, and this work influenced so many future thinkers, in particular situationists, who talk about how a detour, or the term they use, a détournement, which literally means a hijacking or an appropriation of a scene, takes place through this action. And this is what happened when I did this little documentary journey through Berlin. And what prompted it was this op-ed piece. I was asked upon arrival at the Berlin Academy to write a piece, and they told me I had like 3 or 4 days. They needed it immediately. And the anniversary was coming up of the famous speech by President Eisenhower. This first presidential farewell address shown on television, usually it was just radio and television, and where he famously spoke of the military-industrial complex. Its unwarranted influence, but also how there was the emergence of a techno-scientific elite in universities that were basically betokened to military-industrial interest. And so I talked about this, but with the hook that Berlin had no street named after the guy who liberated Germany. You had obviously a Kennedy Strasse, you had a Kennedy Platz, you had a Truman Strasse, you had a John Foster Dulles Strasse. Here's one here. And why not Eichstrasse? I mean, even when I came in from the airport here, I noticed that Michigan has, not Michigan, but Ann Arbor has a Eisenhower Strasse. Or maybe it was in Detroit. Probably it was in Detroit. It is? Okay. Sorry. I'm trying to appear cosmopolitan. And I was trying to figure this out, and what happened is, now I got embroiled in this debate because of an event that happened. Shortly after we screened Human Terrain, I was actually doing the screening. I was on a panel with the press attaché Mitchell Moss from the embassy, along with their ambassador to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Mitchell and I got into it about the politics of the war. And I just mentioned the fact about these different streets and why there wasn't an Eisenhower Strasse, and this wonderful optical fairyland, as Krakauer called it in the interwar period, formerly in East Germany and East Berlin, is on Rosa Luxemburg Strasse. Rosa Luxemburg, the great Spartacist leader of the uprising that failed in Berlin after the First World War. She was shot, beaten, killed, thrown into the river, and she has a street. And it remains Rosa Luxemburg Strasse. That's the equivalent of having like an Emma Goldman Strasse in Washington, D.C. It's not going to happen. And so we talked about the politics of street names, and that set me off on one of these drifts, one of these situationist drifts, where I went to Krakauer Platz, named after the great interwar critic. Clausewitz-Strasse, like 2 blocks away from Krakauer Platz, you have Clausewitz-Strasse, named after the great Prussian strategist who told us about war being a continuation of politics by the means, the fog and friction of war. It's like getting an education as you walk through the streets. And then just a bit further down, Walter Benjamin Strasse. So I was trying to make sense of all this when I got a phone call and then a request, largely prompted by this. It was a Der Spiegel piece that they were trying to name a street after Ronald Reagan. And they were successful in several other capitals. And the question is, why not Berlin? I mean, Berlin is, after all, where Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War, right? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev, open these gates. This is part of the mythology of President Reagan. And it's what became controversial is that the Der Spiegel, in the introduction to an op-ed piece that was written, took word for word, practically, my introduction to the piece about Eichstrasse. Why is there no Reaganstrasse? And they named all the other streets. So I got these phone calls from the press saying, would I respond? And Deutsche Welle, which is the equivalent of I guess, it's BBC of Germany, came with this van. And this all happened within a 2-week period. This is a bit earlier when, this is Condoleezza Rice over there, opening or unveiling the Reagan 10, is that 10 meters or is that 10 feet? That looks more like 10. 10 feet. I don't know, it looks pretty tall. It's big. Bronze statue of Ronald Reagan in Grosvenor Square outside the American Embassy. Similarly, this was done in Prague, in Hungary, and what you saw was the Reaganization of the landscape of these capitals. Didn't hear about in the States, but it was like all over the press in Europe. And a series of events happened. I was then asked to go do a piece with the left-wing newspaper, and on the way to the TATS headquarters, I was early, and I stopped off at Checkpoint Charlie, which is the famous crossing. Now there's a big museum, and in this museum, I walk into it, is the Ronald Reagan installation. It's a pretty tacky museum until you go into this very professional section. So I started to do a little digging, and it turns out it's funded by the Reagan Foundation, which is run by Reagan's son, who was instrumental in this effort to rename streets. But it turns out there's 3 different Reagan foundations, all nonpartisan charitable organizations, that were putting up the money for this effort to Reaganize the European landscape and basically do what those street names do. Normalize a pretty controversial figure. You walk by a street named after Clausewitz, you think, well, this guy's okay. You know, he's a smart guy. You know, just the everyday passing of Rosa Luxemburg Strasse. Maybe she wasn't, you know, a radical revolutionary who we should treat as having, you know, horns and a tail, is often the mythology we get in some of the textbooks in the United States. So this normalization and Reaganization come together in the naming of streets. So I left Checkpoint Charlie using my Google map on my iPhone, and I was supposed to meet this correspondent on a street named Kochstrasse. But he had told me it was Rudi Dutschke Strasse. Now, maybe Rudi Dutschke isn't a well-known figure in some circles, but he was the radical of the 60s who was shot by a crazed individual who evidently had been reading Der Spiegel's tirades against the leftist revolutionaries. Rudi survived, and Taz, as being a left-wing newspaper on Kochstrasse, renamed the street through a petition process, Rudi Dutschke Strasse. However, Google Maps never made the change. Part of the reason is Spiegel's headquarters, right-wing newspaper, is at the end of the street. So this struggle over street names is not simply a semiotic game. It's a political game. And this came home. Here's a picture of Rudi Dutschke Strasse. For anybody who knows the literary critic, art historian, Hal Foster, he did give me permission to use this photograph. That's Hal pointing up to Rudi. Now, I then was making this tour of the various streets, and the effort was to name this Platz, which is in the center of Berlin, Ronald Reagan Platz. And they failed, because it turns out the decision to rename streets is by municipalities, left-wing municipality in this area. So they moved. This Reagan Foundation decided to try to name this area Kudamm, Kurfürstendamm, and that became the subject during this, what I'm going to show this final clip. And how much time do I have left? About 5, 10? Okay. Okay, then I'm going to show the clip just to wrap this up and give you a little bit of a conclusion here. This, by the way, is the street activity that took place when Reaganstrasse ended up not getting voted through the municipality. They basically photoshopped all the streets, Rosa Luxemburg Strasse, and put Ronald Reagan Strasse over here. You just see the remnants of it, because the people who lived on the street tore them off. So there were street fights going on while I was doing this documentary. And here's what ended up as the final piece. I'm going to cut it short a little bit. We're a little slow in the uptake for some reason today.
Berlin is not exactly awash with American flags. We did find a star-spangled banner next to the Brandenburg Gate. But there's a good reason for that. And if you're specifically looking for monuments to Ronald Reagan, you need to literally go underground. This subway station features his legendary quote by the Berlin Wall. But some conservative politicians want more. A square or street named after the former U.S. president. It's a divisive issue among locals.
That could be interesting. We have so many American names in Berlin. There's Franklin Hospital or Washington Platz, so I could imagine it happening.
I like it because the man brought political change, not just for Berlin, but for Germany and the whole world.
Just because he once said the wall had to go? That's no big deal.
Nancy and Ronald Reagan during their famous visit to West Berlin back in 1987.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2 years later, the wall indeed came down. American officials feel that the year in which Reagan would have turned 100 is an apt time for the city to honor him.
This is Mitch Moss, the political affairs attaché.
We'd love to see any symbol of recognition of Ronald Reagan and his legacy for Berlin. I believe the early end of the Cold War had significant implications for Berlin and its people.
The current city government is made up of a coalition of parties from the left and sees no pressing need for such a move.
We're not blocking anything. Mr. Reagan is an honorary citizen of Berlin and is part of the city's image. We've so far been unable to meet the CDU's special request to name a square or street after him for the reasons given.
What he means is that the names of streets and squares in Berlin are decided at the district council level, and the conservative Christian Democrats in the Charlottenburg-Wilmersdorf area had an idea. This is busy Joachimsthaler Platz, penciled in as the place to be named after Ronald Reagan. For once, local politicians are debating an issue with global news appeal.
He should be honored with this on the 100th anniversary of his birthday. We wouldn't have this reunified city and reunified Germany if he hadn't said what he said then so prophetically. Yes, I know, you all would have written the history books differently at that point.
You want to name a square after someone who ordered a covert war in Nicaragua and killed 60,000 people, mainly civilians.
The result? 14 votes in favor, 31 against. So, no Ronald Reagan Platz in this part of town at least. The square where John F. Kennedy made his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech was named after him just days after his assassination. Various kindergartens and schools in the city also bear his name. There are plenty of streets named after communists and socialists, primarily in the East, a legacy of the Cold War era. And there are also other monuments to important leftist figures. Visiting American professor James Derian has researched street names in the city and provides insights into the debate.
The contestation of street names is really a symbol of the East-West divide. Who, for instance, got to appropriate the name of Karl Marx? Who got to have the name of Rosa Luxemburg? These are street fights, but they're also political fights. And then how you take that history and you make it almost everyday, normal, you walk by it, becomes very much part of the political program of the East and of the West.
And that, says the professor, is why Ronald Reagan Square ought to be in the middle of the city,
which I never said.
Between the old East and West. Would the Americans
it's why there's a
be glad to see this
voiceover.
prominent square
And this is where they now
Ronald
punk
Reagan?
Mitch Moss.
First and foremost, that's unthinkable. I would guess that it's been called Pariser Platz for 300 years or so. But we would be happy to see any gesture of recognition for Reagan.
Pariser Platz, right next to the Brandenburg Gate, will definitely not be renamed in Ronald Reagan's honor. And the local council has announced that the next new street names will belong to famous women.
Okay, I'm just going to end with this quote, and I'll leave for the Q&A about sort of what happened in the making of this, how it got edited, how Mitch Moss got punked, how words were put into my mouth, and why it's important to make media, not just simply be an object of it. The power is in the editing room and in the maker as well. I just want to end with one image, provocation, because this is how history is made with the global media increasingly. And I want to leave you with this one thought experiment that we all know that people say that Facebook was, if not the maker of, certainly an enabler of the Arab Spring in Cairo at Tahrir Square. But many people are already now starting a new mythology, saying it was actually Condi Rice going to Cairo a couple years ago, well now several years ago, giving a speech about freedom in the way that Reagan did in front of the gates, saying, Mubarak, you must free your people. So I imagine, say like just 25 years from now, that Tahrir Square will be renamed, and there'll be a hologram 50 meters high of Condi Rice, and the square will be named Mark Zuckerberg Square. Thank you very much.